I always like to talk about, when I'm going through a book, I always like to talk about at first the context of that book. And of course we have before, but since we got some people here who haven't probably heard any of these sermons, Peter, First Peter was written to people who are being persecuted. And in fact, it tells you here in the very first verse, from Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those temporarily residing abroad in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, the province of Asia, and Bithynia, who are chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father by being set apart by the Spirit for obedience and for sprinkling with Jesus Christ's blood. May grace and peace be yours in full measure. That's the net version, and I use it kind of interchangeably with the ESV. The ESV is a little more conservative, but basically it's all the same. There was persecutions in the Roman Empire that were at different times. Sometimes they would just kind of not do any persecutions and kind of accept the Christians, or grudgingly accept them. And then as more and more people got saved and got into the church, there was more of that went on. But there was also there was regional persecutions where the empire, after Jesus was split into two parts, the Eastern and the Western. The Eastern was generally more accommodating to Christians. And the capital there was a place called Constantinople, and you may know it as today it's called Istanbul, as part of Turkey. In fact, all these places that Peter named are now part of the country of Turkey, but at the time they were different little nations and different places. They were all part of the Roman Empire though. But anyway, you had these regional persecutions, or sometimes it would just be one town, and the Christians would just get up and go to the next town where they were better accepted. But you can imagine what that'd do to your business if you were a local businessman, what it'd do to jobs, families. And a lot of families, they all weren't Christians just like today. But sometimes there would be a general persecution, depending on who the emperor was. And when there was a general persecution, there really wasn't nowhere to go to. I mean, the Roman Empire generally ruled the world. Most of the known world at the time, the civilized world, belonged to Rome. If you went out of that area, you went into a barbarian area where they would probably just kill you. So they would have to run and hide underground during those times. And that's kind of one of the times that he's talking about here, where these people are having to get out there. And of course, if you're on the run from a persecution, you can imagine what that could do to your faith. You know, anything like that can do terrible things to your faith. So Peter is he's encouraging these Christians to stay strong in their faith, to even suffer if you need to be. And he's also, in this section, he's talking about people who are employees or servants, or sometimes in the Roman Empire they would have been slaves. But he's talking to those people, and he's also talking to husbands and wives. And there's two reasons that he tells us here that we need to submit to these people, specifically the masters or the employers. Is number one, it's a great example. In fact, some of the empires, some of the emperors and some of the rulers would say, well, those Christian atheists, we hate them because they don't bow to the gods, but they're always good citizens. You know, they obey the laws, except for the one about worshiping things. They obey the laws, and that's one reason. So that would have an effect of diminishing persecution, because you know it's kind of hard to beat on somebody that's saying, okay, I'm doing what you say, and you know I'm a good citizen. You know, you can't kick nobody for stopping at the red lights and obeying the speed limit or whatever it was. I know that they didn't have speed limits then, but for obeying the laws. And talking about husbands and wives too, and we'll go into that a little more, but all of that was an example that Jesus gave us. And so what Peter is really talking about here is being more like Jesus, which is what Christians are supposed to do. You know, that's it. So this is kind of a long passage. I'm going to read all of it here. 1 Peter 2, and we'll go from verse 18 through the end of the chapter, and then into verse 7 of chapter 3. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, that when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But when you do good and suffer for it, you endure. This is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you've been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of your heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they're heirs with you of the grace of life, so your prayers may not be hindered. So, going back to 2:18, talking about servants, employees, bosses, they apply to us today. You know, most of us are not employees anymore, but we remember when we were, and we have family people that are. But the word here that's translated unjust talks about not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. The word here, unjust in the Greek, is translated scolios, which refers, you know, that's where we get our word scoliosis, that applies to the spine being crooked. Well, that's before he's talking about these crooked people. So Christians are not only to to respect bosses who are good bosses, but also bad ones. And it's a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. And it all goes back to the cross. It always goes back to Jesus, who was beaten unmercifully and hung on a cross, and he never said an angry word to anybody. That's kind of hard for us to do, isn't it? Yeah. But Peter's advice here seems counterintuitive in a way, but at the same time, I mean, these Christians could have, if they'd have thought differently, they could have got up gangs, and they could have attacked the government. They could have killed the officers that were enforcing the law. They could have killed the magistrates. They could have started a regular little war, and then they'd all been killed. They'd all been killed, and Peter knew that. In Peter's day, a servant could legally be beaten. If you weren't doing your job, you could be beaten because basically you were a slave. But nowadays, nobody's going to beat you, but you can be demoted and all that other stuff. Accused of lying, accused of being lazy and shoddy work. But he says, but if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. So we need to seek fairness and justice in the workplace, just like we do in the government, but at the same time, to do it in a peaceful way and to do it in a respectful way. And that's hard sometimes. That's hard when you got somebody who's not very good to you, you know. And thankfully in America, we can still quit and go somewhere else, and that may be the best thing to do. And there's nothing Peter says that says you can't escape from those things, but to do it in a respectful way. So for a righteous people, we'll always do what's righteous and just. And so this influences people for Christ when they see you being that way. That stands out when somebody is respectful, no matter what they get in return. And to live obediently, Peter writes, "For this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving an example, so you might follow in his steps." So, you hear the saying, what would Jesus do? That is a good question to ask us in any situation. What would Jesus do? And Peter basically refers back to Isaiah 53:9, and he says Jesus committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. And now Peter lived with Jesus for 3 years. He knew him pretty well. He knew what he intended. He didn't always agree with it. Peter, in fact, is one of them people who a lot of times didn't agree with him. And Peter's the guy who he's got a bad temper, because when Jesus was being arrested, there was a big crowd of people there, all of them with weapons, and that didn't stop Peter. He just went up and cut the guy's ear off with his sword. And so Peter was one of them people who had to learn all this stuff too, just like we do. He's no different. But when he was reviled, he didn't revile in return. People went by when Jesus was on the cross, shaking their heads and spitting at him and insulting him and saying, maybe Isaiah could come and get him, maybe Elijah can come and get him. Revile means to attack and to insult. And so basically, we're supposed to, in the workplace, be respectful, be nice when other people aren't, and show that you're a Christian, because by that, you're just as much a witness as you are when you preach about the Bible. In fact, in some ways, maybe a better witness. So we go on to talking about marriage. Peter keeps talking about living an exemplary life. The very best life you can think of is what Peter's talking about. He's talking about living a good life. And living a good life is not only relating to the government good. We don't have to agree with our government. I'm not saying we should. In fact, I disagree with them most of the time on major stuff. But we still pay our taxes. We still obey the law. Same thing with bosses. We do it in a respectful way, or we quit and go somewhere else. And when we quit, we don't say, bam, you SOB, I'm leaving here and I'll never work here again. You don't do that. And believe me, even from a secular side, that's good advice, because you never know what's going to happen down the road. If you quit and go on and then come back later and you need a job, it might be good if the guy remembers you as somebody who was a nice person. So Peter goes on to talk about marriage. And here he's writing, I believe, according to most scholars, he's writing mostly to believing wives who are married to pagan husbands, because that happened a lot early on. It still happens a lot. But in Peter's day, a woman who became a Christian kind of brought shame and humiliation on her husband, because he was a good pagan, and all of a sudden she believes one of these cultish things. That's how it was looked at the time. But it was considered an act of rebellion. So if the wife acts in a respectful manner and submits to her husband, then the chances of her, basically what he's saying is the chances of her making him a Christian or having him come to Christ is even greater. So somebody suggested the reason 6 verses relate to the wife and only 1 to the husband is most men have shorter attention spans. So whatever it is, we have these commands to improve our marriage. And Peter he says, likewise, He was referring also back to those two other things that he was talking about, you know, the government and the workplace. And another thing to remember is a Christian wife's supposed to be submissive to her husband as the leader of the family, but she's not supposed to be submissive to anybody else, any other men. You know, it don't include every man. So, and the obvious reason here is to improve the marriage, not destroy it. And you know, if two people are always at each other's throats all the time and not ever agreeing on things, then it doesn't promote good marriage, and a lot of divorces happen because of that. So Peter's husband here is a servant leader if he's a Christian. He's not an overbearing person. And people have perverted the word submission. You know, they think if you say submission, it means you're supposed to be a doormat. But it really means equal people submitting to one another, just because Christ is the head of the church, the man is the head of the family. And he says in 1 Corinthians 10:31-33, he says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks, to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. 1 Corinthians 10:31-33. Now, Paul was one of those guys, and I'm sure Peter was very much like that. Paul was one of them guys that when he was talking to you, no matter what you said to him, what he was thinking in his mind was, how can I get this guy to accept Christ, or this person? How can I bring them to Christ? He wasn't thinking about what he could say in return, or how bad it was being said to him. You know, even when he was being beaten with sticks, he was thinking, how can I get these people to accept Christ? And not many people would have that kind of dedication to the job. But basically, he wants the wives to have good conduct that are married to these pagan husbands, because eventually they may be to the point where they accept Christ. And there's been stories about that, of these men that went all their lives, and then at one point they did, because of their wives, because their wives were good witnesses. And of course, in the first century, people weren't any different than they are now. You know, we like to think that we're more advanced and all that, but really, that's just an accumulation of knowledge. Women like jewelry and good hairdos and good, pretty clothes in the first century, just like they do now. Not any different. And he's not saying for you not to be attractive. And he's not saying for you not to wear nice clothes. He's just saying for that not to be your emphasis, not to be your put it on just to get attention. You can dress stylishly, it's not a problem. But fine linen or silk here refers to nice, stylish, and could be even expensive clothing. And purple was a very expensive dye at the time. In fact, in Esther, they talk about King Ahasuerus wore a robe of fine linen and purple. And the Bible teaches that women should dress attractively but not provocatively. You don't want your husband to be looking at some other man either. You know, you want him to be looking at you. So, and he goes on to say, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. So if you're doing the same thing he was talking about with the government and with the bosses, it's the same thing as being someone's wife. You know, you've got that gentle and quiet spirit. Somebody who doesn't cause quarrels, but ends quarrels. And that goes a long way. So woman's beauty shouldn't depend on her outward appearance. And of course, a man's not either. I mean, men aren't considered beautiful. I don't know about nowadays, but anyway, we're not to cause quarrels and things like that. Peter reminds his readers, for this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their own husbands. And then he uses an example, Sarah, who obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. But Abraham, in Genesis 12:11, said that she was beautiful in appearance. So he was worried about losing his wife, and that's why he wanted her to pretend he was thinking that people would kill him to get his wife. So he screwed up twice by going down and telling people tell them that you're my sister. And that about got him in trouble a couple of times. But she was submissive to Abraham. At the same time, she usually got her own way, and that's pretty much how women are. Being submissive didn't make her a doormat, but when she wanted to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael, Abraham didn't want to, but God agreed with her, and off she went. Sarah messed up some herself, when she laughed at the angels that said she was going to have a baby. But in general, she was a pretty good example. She's considered the mother of the Jewish people, and even us, if we're grafted in. And Peter writes, and you are her children. So Christian wives are the children, the daughters of Sarah, really. We're the spiritual daughters of Sarah. Don't fear anything that is frightening, 3:6. So, there's a lot of women today that are going to light into somebody like that, because women today are kind of taught that they can do anything a man can do, and that's got us into trouble in several ways. There's a lot of things women can do that men can't do, and there's things that men can do that women can't do. And we see that when these so-called trans women compete in sports with real women. They always win because they're stronger. And that's one reason why I feel that these laws preventing that are a good thing. And North Carolina has one. It just got passed. That's great, isn't it? So these liberated women despise the idea of somebody being submissive. But we need to remember 2 Timothy 1:7. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. And self-control is the big thing, So, but also men, he's got a word here for men too. He says, likewise, husbands. We're to be submissive in certain ways to our wives too, when there's things that they need. We're not to be tyrants. And in the past, I've read about Christian husbands that were tyrants, in the 1800s and on back, it was considered okay to just beat your wife if she didn't do what you wanted to do. And they would basically say, that's God's will that I beat you. And the woman would either say, okay, or maybe not. Maybe not. So husbands have to be unselfish. We have to be respectful. And basically it comes right down to it, is we have to communicate with each other, and we have to be respectful for each other's wants and needs. And if we do that, we're going to get along fine anyway. Live with your wives, Peter says, in an understanding way. What is that? Understanding is listening and knowing what we need to be doing. Showing honor to our wives. The word honor means high value or dignity in the Greek. Husbands, treat your wife like she's the most valuable thing in your life. And in fact, Proverbs 31:10 says, an excellent wife who can find, she's far more precious than jewels. So you're a jewel, But when he talks about the weaker vessel here in 3:7, he's talking about physically weaker and maybe emotionally too, because most women are more emotionally fragile. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I think most of them are. You can hurt people with words, and I think you can hurt women deeply with harsh words. And you can men too, as far as that goes. But a husband is never to use his superior strength to get his way. Whatever way that is. He's not to do that. He's never to bully his wife. And that's a horrible sin, really, if either one of us bully either of us. We're not to hurt each other. Peter reminds husbands that their wives are heirs with you of the grace of God of life. That means that the Lord's grace comes down on all of us equally. Husbands are continually to cultivate understanding of their wives and show them honor. And he says you're to last so your prayers may not be hindered. It kind of implies if you don't do that, that God ain't going to listen to your prayers. You know, the secular world out there, they reject all of this. I mean, they'd say this is just fake stuff. It doesn't apply in today's world. It's not good. But Psalm 127:1 says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. So we've got to build a house. Let the Lord build our house. And in order to be like Christ and to have the same influence on people that he had in a lot of ways, is we have to be like him. And in order to be like him, we've got to do this and treat each other right. So that's what it all comes down to. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for your word. Thank you for the Apostle Peter and his take on these things. Help us, Lord, to, like all the other good words we hear from the Bible, to take it and live by it. And we just love you. We thank you for it, and we praise you today. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.
For the rain.